Hello, Holyoman.
Hello.
Yeah, hello. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you. And welcome to the Global Virtual Summit 2026. And
Yes, I'm very excited.
yeah, before going to start your session, I want to introduce you to our audience.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Holly Owen is a registered psychotherapist based in Ontario, Canada, the founder of Holly Owen Therapy and associate at Red Brick Wellness. They provide trauma informed, queer affirming psychotherapy with a particular focus on supporting two SLGBTQIA+ individuals navigating anxiety, burnout, identity exploration, and life transitions while also working with clients outside of the queer community. Their work includes supporting athletes, first responders, and individuals experiencing high levels of stress and performance pressure. Drawing from acceptance and commitment therapy ACT, dialectical behavior therapy DBT, and values based approaches, Holly helps clients reconnect with their values, build emotional resilience, and move toward more authentic and sustainable ways of living. Through therapy, speaking engagements, and workshops, they advocate for authenticity, psychological flexibility, and sustainable well being. That was a great bio, Holly, and the stage is all yours.
Okay. Oof. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Let me see if I remember how to do this. I did practice, so let's just see. Okay. Um, Give me 1 second. Okay, looks like everything is set up great. If I'm going too fast or any questions or anything like that, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I'll try to go over them once I am finished, but I am wanting to explore with you all today this idea of thinking about authenticity over productivity. So, as we dive in, I actually want to first take you back to a time when you were a young child. Life probably felt rather simple then, right? Maybe you spent your days outside with friends, built imaginary worlds, or got lost in play until someone called you in for dinner. And truthfully, the biggest disappointment was usually being told that it was time to come inside or go to bed. And as children, we naturally listened to ourselves. When we were tired, we would rest. When we were curious, we would explore. And we weren't necessarily measuring our worth by how much we accomplished. We were just simply existing. So, when did that simplicity change? For many of us, it happened quite gradually. So responsibilities increased, expectations grew, and achievement became something we strived for. Those changes weren't all inherently bad, mind you. Many were necessary, and some were, in fact, rather rewarding. But somewhere along the way, many of us absorbed a different message. And that was that our worth was tied to our productivity. Being busy, in fact, became a badge of honor that we all tend to wear quite proudly. But exhaustion also became normal. Rest became something that we believed we also had to earn. For some, these started out as well intentioned lessons about responsibility. But for others, they were maybe reinforced through school, work, family situations, societal expectations. But regardless of where they came from, they all sort of slowly shaped the belief that the more productive we were, the more valuable we actually became. And over time, our sacrifices that we would make tended to be pieces of ourselves to keep this up. We would ignore boundaries, dismiss needs, postpone things that bring us joy, all because we believe that there is something more that we had to accomplish. Eventually, anxiety before work then feels normal. Chronic stress becomes expected, and burnout, well, that becomes something that we joke about rather than seriously question. And perhaps the hardest part is that for many of us, we don't actually realize that this is what's happening. We just think that this is what it means to be a fully realized adult. So, as a psychotherapist, clients often will ask me how they can manage their time better, become more productive, or just push through burnout. And they're all sort of hoping that I can give them some magical strategy that keeps them living exactly as they are, just with less suffering. But that's rarely the problem, because no productivity hack can solve a life that's built around believing that your worth depends on constantly performing. I've come to believe that healing doesn't begin by asking, how can I do more? It actually begins by asking, who am I underneath the pressure to perform? And what's really surprising is that question specifically tends to be very difficult to answer. In therapy, I often meet people who believe they're just looking for better time management, more motivation, or a more effective way to tolerate stress. But as we begin to explore experiences, something else emerges, and that is that their ability to hustle has become deeply intertwined with their sense of purpose. When our worth becomes dependent on what we accomplish, it doesn't take long for limiting beliefs to take root. Maybe you've heard some of the ones on the screen before, or perhaps maybe you've even said them to yourself. If I don't work hard enough, I'm a failure. People will think less of me if I can't keep up, or I have to earn my worth. And these beliefs are incredibly powerful because they work, at least maybe for a while. They motivate us to push harder, take on more, ignore our own limits. But eventually they stop driving us forward and actually start pulling us away from ourselves. And the reason why I say that is because I know it, as I've also lived it. When I was caught in toxic hustle culture, if you will, those thoughts were pretty constant. And at the time, I called it motivation. But looking back, I can actually see it was fear disguised as ambition. I became so disconnected from myself. The parts of me that didn't fit this sort of ideal definition of productivity actually became, well, at least they felt rather inconvenient, almost like something I should get rid of. I honestly believe that life would be easier if these parts of my identity just kind of didn't exist or would simply disappear. And over time, I actually learned the opposite. Those scattered pieces of myself weren't truly the problem. They were actually the solution. I needed to pull all those pieces together and find a way to fit them back into one whole being. And that's why authenticity is such a pillar of my work. Not as a buzzword or as an aesthetic, but as a foundation for approaching mental health in general. Authenticity is truly about living in a way that honors your values, your needs, your emotions, your limits, and just your identity as a human being. And when we move away from those things long enough, our nervous system internally will let us know before we even realize what's happening. Stress increases. Stress becomes chronic rather than something that we just experience with certain events that take place in our life. Rest becomes very uncomfortable and burnout becomes normal. And most people just jump to the assumption that these experiences mean that they're simply not coping well enough. But I see something very, very different. I actually see people who have spent so long surviving someone else's definition of success that they've just lost touch with their own. So that's where the real work begins, not by asking people to be more productive, but by helping them reconnect with who they already are. So, all in all, what does this actually look like in therapy? This whole reconnecting with authenticity thing? Well, I can tell you that it does not begin with me telling clients who they are. It actually begins with helping them just be curious about themselves again. And one of the first things I like to explore is the difference between expectations clients believe they should have and the values that they already hold. And those two things couldn't be more different. Many clients get trapped in what I like to call the should cycles. So I should be doing more. I should be able to handle this. I should have this all figured out by now. And the problem is that should rarely reflects where somebody actually is. It reflects where they think they're supposed to be. So before we build change, we first have to build awareness as to what these should cycles look like. So to tie it into sort of a succinct framework, this is what it kind of looks like. Mindfulness plays the biggest role, not as a coping strategy, but as a way of honestly asking clients to reflect on this idea of where am I right now? And from there, we build a life that fits the person sitting in front of me rather than the person that they think they should be. So we clarify values, we build small, sustainable choices. And all of those things put together bring us to authenticity. So, for an example, I have a client, a teenager, and they came into therapy truly believing that anything less than a 90% average meant that they were just stupid. Their entire sense of worth rested on their grades. Oop. But rather than trying to convince them that they were wrong, I just became very, very curious about intelligence. Why was intelligence so important? What did being intelligent actually mean to them? And what did constantly pursuing grades give them? And just as importantly, what was it costing them? And as we explored those questions, something became abundantly clear that the value of intelligence was not the only one that they had. They also valued friendship, rest, and connection. But those values had maybe unintentionally disappeared because academic achievement became the only way for this client to measure success. So, together, rather than shifting that value, we instead created a routine and lifestyle that honored all of those values instead of just the one. We didn't lower any expectations, mind you. We just broadened their definition of what it meant to be truly successful. And months later, as we continued to explore our time together, this client actually shared something that surprised them at the end of the school year. Their grades had not dropped at all since we began this work. In fact, they consistently maintained 90% averages in every single subject. But the trade off was that they weren't staying up all night to study. They didn't experience anxiety before an exam. They felt more rested. And perhaps most importantly, they had started to make time for the friendships and connections that they valued so deeply. So, what changed was not intelligence, it was actually just the relationship that they had with themselves. And as therapy continued together, their values shifted and evolved, but also did the routines and the structure that we built together. It's not about a one size fits all that sticks forever. It's about constantly checking in and asking, where am I right now and what may need to change? Because authenticity isn't the destination. It is a ongoing process. And the same principles show up regardless of what somebody brings into the therapy room. Sometimes it's a student. Sometimes it is someone experiencing burnout because of work. Sometimes it is someone who spent years caring for everyone else around them. But what they all have in common is this: they started measuring their worth by how much they could do for others. They believe they have to keep giving, keep producing, keep providing, because if they stop, that somehow means that they have failed. Whether that role is employee, partner, caregiver, athlete, or parent, the underlying belief is always the same. If I can't do it all, I'm just not good enough. And that's why I spend time asking clients what truly matters to them rather than exploring with them what they believe they should be doing. Another example, there is a client of mine who's a parent, and they came into therapy because they were constantly overwhelmed with this pressure to do more as a parent. They were worried that they weren't doing enough for their children and carried a very deep fear about being a bad parent or perceived as a bad parent. So instead of talking about just another parenting strategy, I instead opted to ask a different question. When your child is 30 years old, what do you hope they say about growing up with you as their parent? And what was interesting was the answer came to this client immediately. They said, I want my children to say they had fun and that they felt safe growing up. And I let that sit there. I didn't say anything. And then the client laughed and said, that sounds so simple. And I remember in that moment responding, well, maybe that's because authenticity is often simple. And to make it clear, simple does not mean easy. Simple means sustainable. When we shifted our focus away from trying to meet every impossible expectation and instead built daily choices around those two values, fun and safety, something changed. The parent became more present with their children. They noted that their stress had significantly decreased. They no longer felt as though they were constantly falling behind with all of these new things that they had to do. And that wasn't because they were doing more or were suddenly able to do more, but it was because they stopped measuring themselves against a definition of success that was actually never truly theirs to begin with. So instead of asking, how can I do more? We should begin by asking, how can I live in a way that reflects what matters most to me? Looking across all of these clients, I've noticed something quite remarkable, that despite the details always being different, the work is always the same. Because authenticity lives in the space between the expectations we've inherited and the values that we've truly chosen. So that's where the change needs to happen. That's where sustainable healing needs to happen. So before I wrap things up, I actually would like to invite you all to do something for me. I want you to take a breath here. And I want you to think about a time in your life that you've had recently where you took a moment just for yourself. Maybe it was the moment that you sat down with your morning coffee or tea before hopping on today. Maybe it was when you stopped work for the day last week. Or maybe it was the quiet moment that you have right before you go to bed. And I want you to think in this moment, what what happened then? Were you able to actually rest in that moment that you're thinking about? Or did your mind immediately tell you that there's something else that you maybe should be doing? And now remember that child, the one that I brought up at the beginning, the one who played simply because playing was enough. What changed between that child and the person now? Yeah, life became maybe more complicated, responsibilities absolutely increased. We experienced maybe some loss, pressure, expectations, and countless messages about what success should look like. But somewhere along the way, many of us became disconnected from ourselves. So would like to leave you all with three questions. What messages am I carrying about success, productivity, and worth? Are those beliefs actually mine? And finally, what would it look like to build a life that reflects my values instead of my fears? Because authenticity doesn't ask you to abandon ambition. It asks you to make sure that your ambition isn't costing you yourself. And in a strange way, I think many of us needed to be a bit disconnected before we could even realize what authenticity truly feels like. At least that's absolutely what happened to me. I had to notice, I had to question, and then I had to choose. And now I have the extreme privilege of helping others do the same. So maybe that child that we imagined at the beginning of this morning's conversation never actually disappeared. Maybe they're still there, just patiently waiting for us to remember that our worth was never truly something that we had to earn. Thank you. Okay, I noticed some questions. While pursuing, okay, so I had a good question here. How can people stay true to themselves while pursuing their goals? Great question. Um, Oftentimes when we're looking at goals as well as marrying sort of goals and authenticity, I like to sort of explore with people, are the goals that we're even working towards realistic? So remembering that in order to build authenticity, we first have to start with mindfulness. I will often ask people to think about the goals that you have, are they reflective of where you currently are? So that might mean that maybe we need to build additional skills. Maybe we need to adjust expectations a little bit. Or maybe we just need to sit down and truly plan out what are the steps that we need to take in order to get to where it is that we want to go. It's never a question of saying don't pursue those goals. It's always looking at where are you? Where are the goals that you're working towards? And how can we get there in a way that isn't going to cost you yourself? Another question. What are some of the signs of burnout? Great question. Burnout is tricky. What I will say is that burnout tends to look very different for every single person. I often like to first explore with people burnout from the perspective of, are you able to consistently meet your basic needs? So, this idea of, are you sleeping properly? Are you eating enough? Are you taking care of your hygiene? All of those things tend to slip first when somebody is really, really struggling. And so rather than kind of asking people, are they maintaining their job responsibilities? I like to reflect it back on the person of, are you just taking care of yourself as a human? And if that's struggling, that's where I start the work before moving on to burnout within a work capacity. Another good question. Do you think being busy always means being productive? Why or why not? I personally don't believe that being busy always means that you're productive. But I think that the society in which we tend to live in, especially with social media, a lot of the messaging we get is the busier we are, the more productive we are. So I think over time, those two things have become interconnected.
Yeah. Thank you, Holly Owen. Thank you. Those are very wonderful insights. Thank you so much for your wonderful session today. And
Thank you.
we have one more question from our audience, Holly.
Yep.
Yeah. How can people stay true to themselves while pursuing their goals?
I did answer that one. So, how can they stay true to themselves or pursuing their goals? We have to look at where you are, and then we have to look at where is it that you want to go and figure out how can we bridge the gap in a way that is authentic to you as a person, rather than doing so in a way that is the most maybe efficient or the way in which they quote unquote think they should get there. It's never a question of let's readjust the goal. It's looking at what is the goal, where are you, and what can we do together to get you there without significantly sacrificing who you are.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your valuable time today, Holly. We
Thank
got
you.
a
Thank
lot
you
of
for having
knowledge. Yeah.
me.
Thank you so much. And please be on the backstage and join the next session, Holly.
All right. Awesome.
Thank
Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Bye bye.
Bye.